I'm Julia Manchester. What's America thinking? That's the question we're asking here every week. Let's dive into what has many people on edge right now. From terror attacks to ongoing wars to issues with our own border, tensions are rising and foreign policy is quickly becoming a major concern for Americans.
I think it's the Middle East and Israel and Gaza. It's just one of those things that's continuing to drive a stake in between the right and the left and whose side you're on. Just another thing that's causing that divide.
It's a exceedingly dangerous time as far as I'm concerned. A war, destruction, inflation. There's good things, can generate jobs in certain industries, but at the expense of what?
The biggest thing going on right now, in my opinion, is the human sex trafficking that's going all over the world.
You know, the United States has been a major power for over 50 years, but it seems like it is shifting. There's a lot of other countries that are coming into the picture. We can't just flex muscle anymore.
Americans are clearly passionate about how our policies influence the world, and politicians have taken notice. Generally divided along party lines, solutions to foreign conflicts are increasingly being pitched to boost support in upcoming elections.
I hope I'm not right about World War III, because you're very close to World War III.
If that bill were the law today, I'd shut down the border right now and fix it quickly.
We know that American troops are at risk around the world because of Joe Biden's weak global leadership, that foreign adversaries like Iran fear no reprisal for taking American lives.
National security supplemental that the president put forth back in the fall is incredibly important. It is an emergency request.
The world is on fire, literally. You've got a war in Europe. You've got a war in the Middle East.
We need to ensure Putin continues to fail in Ukraine and Ukraine to succeed. And the best way for that to do that is to pass the supplemental.
Joining me now is Ian Lesser, Vice President of the German Marshall Fund, a nonpartisan think tank. Ian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Very good to be with you.
Wonderful. Well, just to jump into it, a recent AP NORC poll asked Americans what they most want the government working on. The results show a significant rise in foreign policy, jumping from 18% in 2023 to 38% going into 2024. You know, I cover voters and elections, and, you know, it's not often when I hear about foreign policy impacting voters at the ballot box. So why do you think there's been such a spike in this?
Well, it's simply what's happening in the world, and some of the, the comments in your intro section reflect this. People are aware there's a crisis in the Middle East, there's conflict, there's a war in Europe. You didn't talk about that yet, but there's a looming strategic competition with China, which affects all sorts of things, not just our security, but also our prosperity. The border. Not strictly maybe a foreign policy question, but it's part of the equation when people look abroad. And there are so many of these issues that are neither really foreign policy or domestic policy. There's something of both. And people are aware of that, and it's making them anxious. And I think that drives some of what you're seeing.
You know, we've heard Trump and, some other candidates in the past talk about China and that, competition between Washington and Beijing and wanting the U.S. to come out on top. But historically, has foreign policy influenced the way Americans vote?
Well, the short answer is no. Even at times of war, I mean, thinks back to the Vietnam War period and other times when foreign policy was, in a sense, very divisive as a policy issue. Elections at the national level, certainly at the state level, weren't really driven by that. I mean, it was a commonplace to say that foreign policy doesn't decide American elections. That's probably, in a sense, still true. But I wonder, and it's worth thinking about, whether in a very close election year, in a very polarized environment, with a lot of anxiety, whether perhaps that's not changing, and where it's very critical to get out the vote for certain candidates, for Joe Biden, for others. One can think about, progressives in his party who are very, very alienated by some aspects of his foreign policy. They're not necessarily going to go out and vote for Trump if that's the matchup, but will they come out to vote? Or are people going to be turned off because of some aspect of foreign policy? So, maybe this is a year when the traditional behavior doesn't hold.
And multiple global conflicts have erupted: Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Hamas, China, Taiwan. To what degree do you think all of these conflicts can sway voters ultimately?
Well, I think they have a kind of additive effect because, there is a sense of anxiety, I think, in the country. And it's sensed abroad, by the way, among people who watch the United States closely. It's driven by many things, maybe not primarily foreign policy. Maybe it's about the economy. Maybe it's about cultural and social issues, that's for sure. But at the margins, in a very close race, some of these issues can really make a difference. The administration's policy vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis foreign aid, vis-a-vis China or the Middle East. All of these things can make a difference for certain voters. Maybe they won't be, they're not going to switch their vote because of it, but they may turn off certain voters. They stay at home. And it's also a space in which there is a lot of scope for misrepresentation. There is a lot of rhetoric in the campaign trail that Europe isn't doing its part in terms of supporting Ukraine. In fact, they've given twice as much assistance in terms of monetary value to Ukraine than the United States has. You don't hear that very much. So it's a space where people can easily become emotive, but don't necessarily have access to good information.
And zeroing in on the war in the Middle East, 3 U.S. troops were killed in Jordan earlier this month. That's the first time we've seen U.S. casualties since the October 7th attacks on Israel. Do those casualties change how Americans view war and foreign policy going forward?
Well, I do think for the society as a whole, for the average voter who doesn't necessarily follow foreign policy every day, when Americans are killed, it concentrates minds, understandably, rightly so. There's also a prospect of further terrorism that comes about as a result of what's happening in the Middle East that could affect Americans in different ways. And so, yes, I think it does. It sort of brings the issue home to people in a way that, the average newspaper story every day may not. And it does concentrate minds, and it becomes a sort of, a key talking point on the campaign trail of, how tough the United States is going to be, for example, with Iran. Iran backs many of these groups that are seeking to attack American forces and American assets in the Middle East. What's the response? What's the response from the administration that obviously doesn't want to see escalation, but also wants to make a proper response to a very vicious attack on the United States? So, there's a lot at stake, and it's not a normal sort of year. It's a very polarized environment, and candidates will make a lot out of these issues if they wish to.
And Ian, I've been following President Biden a bit on the campaign trail, and oftentimes when you see him give, speeches not necessarily related to the war in the Middle East, there are a lot of protesters calling for a ceasefire that interrupt the president. Sometimes we see these hecklers and sort of brush them off as a one-off event, but this keeps happening with him, and it keeps happening with other politicians. So are you seeing a disconnect between younger Americans' worldviews and our governments on foreign policy? Because we obviously know that a lot of younger Americans tend to be on the pro-ceasefire side of things versus the government.
I do think there are some differences that are making themselves felt. I think younger people, especially younger progressives, the Democratic Party, have been have seen something in what's happening now in our policy towards Israel where they just simply disagree. I mean, that may be at variance with most of the view inside the Democratic Party and even in the country, but it can make a difference in a close race, and I'm sure the Biden campaign will have to respond to that. There are other things. Younger people are more focused on Asia than Europe. There's been a lot of polling about that over the years, and so they tend to be very focused on things that have to do with Asia, whether it's good or bad. It could be, a booming relationship with India, or it could be concerned about China. It could be about jobs. It could be about security. It could be about tech, different sorts of things. So there are different focuses. And I think in different ways, both Trump and Biden have talked about this in a broader sense. I mean, Biden obviously in a much edgier, sharper way, and in a much more nationalistic way. But when the Biden administration talks about a foreign policy for the middle class, they're responding to some of those same anxieties.
And turning to former President Trump, he's gone as far to say that we could be heading into World War III. Should we really be that concerned that we're heading into another global conflict?
I think that's an exaggeration. It does reflect, of course, some reality. The reality is that we have multiple conflicts around the world with multiple potentials for escalation that could engage the United States much more directly. And some of these potential conflicts will be affected simply by the possibility for something to go wrong.
Right.
We may not want escalation. The Chinese may not want escalation, say, over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. This could happen with Russia in the Baltic or in the Black Sea. Neither side probably wants that kind of an escalation, but things simply go wrong and can get out of control. And it's amazing how quickly things can fall apart. I mean, people sometimes talk about the First World War and the sort of sleepwalking into conflict. That was a conflict in which the world basically went from a very stable environment to chaos in the period of weeks. And that was at a time when things didn't move as fast as they do today.
Right. Well, like you said, it only takes one to a few events to really change the course the world is on. Ian, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Very good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.